British officer and one corporal walk into German-held territory carrying a medieval sword. Hours later, they return with 42 prisoners. This is not a legend. This is not Hollywood. This is the true story of the most audacious night raid of World War II, when Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill proved that in war, terror has no expiration date, and a man with absolute conviction can bend reality itself. September 20th, 1943, Pigoletti, Italy, 2200 hours. The moon was a traitor. Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, Mad Jack to those who'd earned the right to call him that, crouched in the shadow of a stone wall that had stood since the Renaissance, watching silver light spill across the Italian hillside like mercury from a broken thermometer. Beside him, Corporal James Ruffle breathed through his mouth, slow and measured, the way you breathe when your heart wants to hammer its way out of your chest, but your training won't let it. They'd been motionless for 17 minutes. The German mortar position lay 200 yards upslope, invisible in the darkness except for the occasional flare of a match, brief as a moth's life, quickly extinguished. Churchill's right hand rested on the basket hilt of his Scottish broadsword. The steel was cold. It was always cold, even in the Mediterranean warmth, even after hours strapped to his hip. The weapon was 36 inches of tempered contradiction, a relic from the 17th century carried by a man born in the 20th, into a war fought with tanks and artillery and automatic weapons that could cut down 100 men in seconds. The sword had no place here. Churchill knew this. Everyone knew this. He carried it anyway. Behind them, 6 miles to the southwest, the beaches of Salerno still stank of cordite and blood. Operation Avalanche, the Allied invasion of mainland Italy, had transformed into Operation Barely Holding On. The British X Corps and the American 6th Corps had come ashore 9 days earlier, expecting a foothold. Instead, they'd gotten a knife fight, vicious and intimate. The German Wehrmacht had contested every yard, every building, every shadow. Lieutenant General Mark Clark's Fifth Army was stuck, pressed against the sea by 4 German divisions that should have retreated, but hadn't. The mathematics were brutal. 100,000 Allied troops pinned down, casualties mounting, the invasion threatening to collapse into another Gallipoli, another monument to ambition drowned in its own blood. This was why Churchill and Ruffle were here, in the dark, hunting mortars. The German position at Pigoletti had spent the last 3 days dropping 81mm shells onto British positions with metronomic precision. 16 dead, 34 wounded, numbers that accumulated like interest on a loan no one wanted to take. Battalion command wanted the mortars silenced. They'd asked for volunteers for a reconnaissance patrol. Churchill had volunteered himself and chosen Ruffle, a lean Londoner with steady hands and the good sense to not ask unnecessary questions. They had not come to reconnoiter. Churchill rose slowly, his joints protesting silently. He was 37 years old, ancient by infantry standards, his body a catalogue of old injuries insufficiently healed. Norway, Dunkirk, Vagsø. Each campaign had taken its tithe of flesh. His left knee clicked when he walked. His right shoulder ached in cold weather. None of this mattered. What mattered was the weight of the sword, familiar as his own heartbeat, and the clarity that descended on him in moments like this, a crystalline focus that made the world simple again, reduced to vectors and decisions, terrain and timing. He touched Ruffle's shoulder, 2 taps. Move. They advanced in the silence that only comes from endless practice, their boots finding purchase on stone and earth without sound, their breathing synchronized to minimize noise. The German sentry was exactly where reconnaissance had placed him, 30 yards from the mortar position, standing in the notch between 2 collapsed walls, a Mauser K98K slung over his shoulder, his cigarette cupped in his palm to hide the ember. Young, maybe 20. His helmet sat at an angle that suggested boredom more than vigilance. Churchill moved through the darkness like something that had never been entirely human. His training was from another age, not just military training, but theatrical training, the physical discipline of stagecraft, the understanding that presence is a weapon more potent than steel. He'd acted in films before the war. He knew about entrances. He knew about timing. He knew that fear is manufactured in the space between expectation and reality, that 3 seconds of absolute bewildering terror can accomplish what 3 hours of combat cannot. He stepped into the moonlight 10 feet from the sentry. The German saw him. Later, much later, Churchill would wonder what the boy saw in that moment. A British officer, certainly, immaculate despite the dust and darkness, his uniform tailored, his posture parade ground perfect. But also, the sword. 3 feet of Scottish steel, basket hilt gleaming, the blade held not in a defensive position but extended, point forward with the casual certainty of a man who'd spent 10,000 hours learning how to kill with it. The sword caught the moonlight and threw it back, transformed, made sharp. The sentry's mouth opened. Churchill moved, not with the explosive speed of youth, but with the economical precision of someone who'd done this calculation before, who understood exactly how many steps it took to close distance, how long it took a surprised man to unsling a rifle, where to place his foot to maintain balance on uneven ground. The sword's tip stopped half an inch from the German's left eye. "Surrender," Churchill said in German, his accent flawless, acquired from a governess in Ceylon when he was 7 years old. His voice carried no anger, no aggression. It was the voice of absolute authority, the voice of a headmaster addressing a student who'd already lost the argument. "Drop your weapon." The Mauser hit the ground. What happened next would be retold in a dozen memoirs, analyzed in staff colleges, dismissed by some as exaggeration, and confirmed by others as documented fact. The truth, as always, was simpler and stranger than legend. Churchill did not march his prisoner back to British lines. He did not call for backup. Instead, he pressed the sword's tip against the small of the German's back. Just enough pressure to be felt through the uniform, not enough to draw blood, and walked him forward towards the next sentry position. Ruffle followed, his Sten gun ready, his face carefully blank in the way of men who'd decided to stop questioning and simply bear witness. The second sentry stood 50 yards upslope, sheltered behind a stone wall that had probably marked some farmer's property line before the war made such distinctions meaningless. Churchill's prisoner walked ahead, moving with the stiff-legged gait of someone whose body knew it was a hostage to someone else's plan. "Wachtposten," Churchill whispered, the German word for sentry post. The prisoner's back stiffened. "Call to him. Password, natural. If you run, if you shout, you die quiet. Understand?" The prisoner understood. Terror is a universal language. "Heinrich," the captured German's voice carried the perfect pitch of routine. "Password, Siegfried." Response, "Brunhilde." The second sentry stepped into view, his rifle lowered, his posture relaxed. "Cigarette break already?" "Lucky, Bass." Churchill emerged from behind his prisoner like a conjurer's trick, the sword already in motion, the blade describing a precise arc that terminated with the point resting against the second German's throat, just above the collarbone, right where the carotid artery pulsed beneath skin. "Down," Churchill said. "Rifle, down, hands, slow." The second German complied. His hands shook. He was older than the first, maybe 25, with the weathered face of someone who'd been in country since the Sicily campaign. His eyes moved from Churchill's face to the sword, to the first prisoner and back again, trying to construct a reality that accommodated what he was seeing. British officers carried pistols. They commanded from command posts. They did not materialize out of darkness with medieval weapons and take prisoners through some black magic that violated every protocol, every expectation, every rule that made war comprehensible. Churchill now had 2 prisoners. He arranged them in single file, the sword's tip touching the back of the second man's neck. They moved upslope, the pattern repeated, sentry post to sentry post, password called, response given. Churchill emerging from shadow with the sword, with that voice of absolute command, with the accumulated terror of each success building on the last. The Germans surrendered not to superior force, but to absolute conviction, to the bewildering impossibility of a man who should not exist doing things that should not work. The third sentry was a corporal. He had enough rank to hesitate, enough experience to understand how profoundly wrong this situation was. His hand moved toward his Luger. "Touch it and you watch your men die first," Churchill said, still in perfect German, his tone unchanged. The sword moved fractionally, its point shifting from the corporal to the private behind him. The message clear. Resistance would be purchased with subordinates' blood. The corporal's hand froze, then fell. Then rose again, slowly, palms out. 4 prisoners. 5. 6. The mortar position itself held 13 men. The gun crew, their security detail, a junior officer who'd been writing a letter home by the light of a shielded lantern. They surrendered en masse, the officer's hands rising before Churchill even spoke, the recognition in his eyes that resistance would be tactically pointless and strategically fatal. The entire crew, their weapons, their equipment, everything simply stopped, frozen by the fundamental absurdity of what was happening. But Churchill wasn't finished. The prisoners walked ahead of him now, a growing column of Germans who'd somehow become complicit in their own capture, each new prisoner adding weight to the psychological momentum. They moved through the darkness, Churchill behind them with the sword, Ruffle beside him with the Sten gun, the entire procession like some fever dream inversion of military logic. They encountered a supply post. 3 men surrendered. A communications runner surrendered. A security patrol. 5 men with MP-40 submachine guns, weapons infinitely more lethal than anything Churchill carried. They stared at the column of their own men walking through the night under guard of 2 British soldiers, and the sheer impossible reality of it broke their will. They surrendered. A forward observation post. 4 men surrendered. The number grew. 25, 30, 35. By the time Churchill turned back toward British lines, he'd been behind enemy territory for 3 hours and 17 minutes. The moon had tracked across the sky, indifferent. Somewhere to the south, artillery rumbled, the distant thunder of the siege at Salerno, where thousands of men fought and died in conventional ways for conventional reasons. Here, in the darkness above Pigoletti, something stranger had occurred, a violation of modernity's rules, a momentary crack in the facade of mechanized warfare through which older magics had seeped. 42 prisoners walked ahead of Churchill, 42 Germans who would not fire another mortar shell, would not kill another Allied soldier who'd been removed from the war not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the application of pure distilled audacity, wielded with surgical precision. Corporal Ruffle, who would survive the war and return to London and spend 57 years trying to explain this night to people who'd look at him with polite skepticism, would later write, "I kept waiting for it to stop working, for someone to call the bluff." But there was no bluff. The colonel believed absolutely that they would surrender, and so they did. The British lines materialized out of the darkness, sandbags and wire and exhausted men who looked up from their positions to see a British lieutenant colonel and a corporal herding 42 German prisoners down the hillside like some demented shepherd bringing his flock home. The sentries' hands went to their weapons, then froze, unsure whether to fire or laugh or simply surrender to the evidence of their own eyes. "Churchill," someone breathed, and the name traveled down the line like electricity, accompanied by something between awe and resignation. Of course, it was Churchill. Who else could it possibly be? The prisoners were processed. The mortar crew's intelligence was extracted. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel David Morgan, stood in the command post with Churchill's after-action report in his hands, a document of clinical brevity that described the night's work with the emotional affect of a grocery list, and tried to reconcile the words on paper with the reality of what had occurred. "Jack," Morgan said finally, his Yorkshire accent flattening the vowels, "you took 42 prisoners with a sword." 42 prisoners and a mortar crew with their equipment, Churchill corrected, his tone suggesting Morgan was missing the important detail. "The mortars were the objective. You took them with a sword." "Well, primarily with command presence and an understanding of psychological warfare. The sword was more of a focusing mechanism." Morgan stared at him. Churchill stared back, his expression suggesting this was all perfectly reasonable, that questioning it revealed a fundamental lack of imagination on Morgan's part. "The men are calling it magic," Morgan said. "It's not magic," Churchill replied. "It's volume." "Volume? If you shout loud enough in the right tone, people tend to obey. It's a well-established principle. I learned it in the theater, also in boarding school. The fundamentals are the same." This was true, technically. It was also profoundly incomplete, like describing the Mona Lisa as paint on canvas or Beethoven's Ninth as organized sound. What Churchill had done above Pigoletti wasn't magic, wasn't supernatural, but it existed in that strange territory where skill becomes art, where preparation meets opportunity with such perfect timing that the result looks like divine intervention. The sword, that ridiculous, anachronistic, utterly effective sword, sat propped in the corner of the command post, its blade clean, never having drawn blood. Churchill had used it as a talisman, a psychological lever, a symbol that bent the reality of modern warfare back toward older, simpler rules, where presence and conviction could trump firepower. In the days that followed, as the Battle of Salerno ground toward its conclusion and the Allies consolidated their foothold in Italy, the story spread. It moved through the British lines, embellished and debated, and generally agreed to be impossible, except for the inconvenient fact that 42 German prisoners sat in holding camps, testifying to its truth. It reached American units, where GIs added it to their growing catalog of British eccentricities. It filtered through intelligence channels to higher commands, where staff officers read the reports and made notes and filed the incident under unconventional operations because no other category fit. But the story's strangest trajectory was backward, through the German lines where the prisoner's testimony created its own mythology. A British officer with a sword who moved through darkness like something from the medieval period, who took soldiers prisoner through sheer force of will, who violated every rule of modern warfare and made it work anyway. The German word that emerged was Gespenst, ghost. Churchill became the ghost of Pigoletti, a bogeyman used to explain the inexplicable, the man who proved that in war, terror has no statute of limitations. Jack Churchill would survive the war. He'd be captured by the Germans after another mad action, escape, be captured again, escape again, survive a concentration camp through a combination of luck and audacity, and finally return to England where peacetime felt like exile. He'd ride his motorcycle too fast. He'd surf off the Scottish coast. He'd play bagpipes in his garden at volumes that alarmed the neighbors. He'd tell stories in pubs to listeners who thought he was lying. But on this night, September 20th, 1943, He simply cleaned his sword, wrote his report, and slept the dreamless sleep of someone who'd done exactly what he'd set out to do. Corporal Ruffles sat outside the command post, smoking a cigarette with hands that still trembled slightly, replaying the night in his mind, trying to identify the moment when reality had bent. He couldn't find it. There'd been no single moment, no clear transition. Churchill had simply decided that 42 men would surrender, and then walked into the darkness and collected them, as if the universe had no choice but to comply. Years later, historians would debate the Pigoletti raid. Some would emphasize Churchill's psychological acuity, his understanding of how fear operates, how authority can be manufactured and deployed. Others would note the tactical brilliance, the way he'd used each captured prisoner to capture the next, building momentum, creating a feedback loop of surrender. Still others would discuss the cultural factors, how the German army's hierarchical structure made soldiers vulnerable to exactly this kind of audacious command presence. All of these analyses would be correct. All would be insufficient, because what happened above Pigoletti wasn't reducible to tactics or psychology or cultural conditioning. It was something older and stranger, a demonstration that war, despite all its technology and doctrine and mechanization, remains at its core a human endeavor, subject to human irrationalities, responsive to human will, exercised with absolute conviction. Churchill had understood this. He'd understood that a sword carried into battle in 1943 was not a weapon but a statement, a declaration that the rules of modernity were provisional, that individual audacity could still bend the arc of history, that terror, properly applied, could accomplish what divisions could not. The moon set over Pigoletti. The war continued. Men fought and died in ways that made sense, for objectives that appeared on maps, following orders that emerged from staff colleges and command hierarchies. And in the middle of it all, for one night, a British officer with a medieval sword had reminded everyone that warfare, stripped to its essence, remains what it's always been, a contest of wills where belief, absolute, unshakable belief, can transform the impossible into the inevitable. The morning of September 21st brought rain. The German mortars above Pigoletti stayed silent. The British lines held. And somewhere in the mathematics of the Salerno campaign, in the accounting of prisoners taken and positions secured and psychological victories won, the night's work added its weight to the Allied cause, one small increment in the long calculation of victory. 42 men, 1 sword, 3 hours. Numbers that made no sense until you understood that sense itself was the variable Churchill had chosen to manipulate. The rain fell on Italian soil that had seen Romans and Visigoths and Normans, on ground where warfare had been practiced for 3,000 years in 10,000 variations. Another story had joined the accumulation, not the largest story, not the bloodiest, but perhaps the strangest. A reminder that even in the age of mechanized slaughter, war remained subject to the oldest rules of all, that terror is personal, that authority is performed, and that a man with a sword and absolute conviction can still, occasionally, bend the world to his will. The prisoners told their story in holding camps. Their guards didn't believe them. Later, when the stories were corroborated, when the official reports confirmed the numbers, the guards believed but couldn't understand. How do you explain that 42 armed men surrendered to 2 soldiers, one of whom carried a weapon from the 17th century? The prisoners couldn't explain it either. They'd been there. They'd surrendered. And in the telling, each found himself unable to articulate the exact mechanism of how it happened. Just the sword in the moonlight, the voice of absolute command, the recognition, instantaneous and undeniable, that resistance was pointless not because it would fail, but because it had already failed, the outcome determined before it began. This, finally, was Churchill's genius, not the tactics, not the theatrics, but the understanding that war is fought in the mind before it's fought with weapons, and that the mind can be conquered through the simple expedient of making surrender seem not like defeat, but like the only logical response to an illogical situation. He'd turned his anachronism into an asset, made his strangeness into a weapon, transformed himself into a myth while still breathing, still mortal, still subject to bullets and artillery like any other soldier. The rain continued, the war continued, and above Pigoletti the ghost of that night lingered, not in any supernatural sense, but in the memories of those who'd been there, who'd witnessed the moment when one man's absolute refusal to accept the limits of the possible had temporarily rewritten those limits. 42 prisoners, 1 sword, the arithmetic of audacity, calculated to perfection, executed with precision, and recorded in history as something that should not have worked, but did, because Jack Churchill believed it would. And belief, it turns out, has always been the most dangerous weapon.